isoleucine restriction induced FGF21 really strongly. And FGF21 is this factor that's also induced whenever you overeat sugar. I basically overeat as much honey and sugar as I possibly can in the early part of the day, and I put all of my protein in one meal at night, and after I eat the protein, I have no carbs. And then I was able to increase my metabolic rate so much where I could eat 3,500 calories a day, and I lost 10 pounds in a month.
So we're seeing people using this sugar diet lately. The premise is to elevate your levels of FGF21.
New research from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center has found a unique hormone that could possibly restrict cravings for sweets and alcohol.
So it has two general effects. One is to cause weight loss, and the second effect is to improve insulin sensitivity.
Is FGF21 the ultimate solution for weight loss? Can we really gorge on as much sugar as we crave and have our body fat melt off without any repercussions at all? In this video, I'm going to break down FGF21 for you and give you the pros versus the cons of its effects so you can decide for yourself if the sugar diet is right for you. And at the end of this video, I'll provide you with 2 different dietary solutions to lose the body fat based on what you decide to do with the info in this video. Now, I want to start with, I am happy that the sugar diet has come around, and I do think that it's going to be a net benefit because it has started to help people eliminate the sugar fear that's been pervasive in the dietary spheres for a while now due to keto, carnivore, and diets like this. Also, I do know that people are losing weight pretty rapidly, at least anecdotally. I see it in the comments and I see it on YouTube. And I know that people are liking this diet because psychologically and logistically, it's easy to maintain because the rules are simple, and also because they're able to eat as much as they want and lose the weight without having to go in or feel like they're starving themselves or they're restricting themselves. And I also do know that a lot of people coming out of low carb or have been on the fence for low carb for a while are looking for reasons to add carbohydrates back into their diet. And I think the sugar diet is providing people with this opportunity. So overall, I do not think that the sugar diet is a net negative. However, I do think it's important that we also understand what we are getting ourselves into with the sugar diet and with upregulating FGF21, because we want to know how deep the water is before we jump. So I think it's important to know, A, how is this diet working? B, what are the pros versus the cons? C, what are the potential long-term ramifications? And then D, if there are long-term ramifications and cons, is there any way to minimize these while maximizing the benefits? Now, with this said, I want to be clear here. My goal is not to rain on people's weight loss parade. My goal is to provide a balanced and nuanced perspective to discussion so people who are on the fence or who are currently doing the diet can make informed decisions about what they're going to continue to do. Also, this video is a TLDR video. I'm trying to keep this one short and concise. And it's part of a much longer video that I'm making going through the FGF21 research in depth. Now, before we jump in, if you would like to know how I set up what I'm now calling an energy-based diet that includes ample amounts of healthy sugar sources while allowing you to optimize your blood glucose levels, body composition, and your metabolic health, I created a free guide you can use to construct an energy-based diet specific to your goals, and I'll put the link in the description below. All right, first things first. What triggers FGF21? What is inducing FGF21 in the body? The big takeaway here is basically stress to the liver or metabolic stress in general. So FGF21 is upregulated in states where we see nutrient deprivation. This is states like protein restriction or amino acid restriction. Also, we see it in starvation, and we see it in fasting, longer-term fasting. We also see FGF21 upregulate in overfeeding, where there's an excess amount of substrate or fuel in the form of carbs and fats provided to the body, and you see weight gain and fat gain and things like this. That starts to trigger FGF21. We also see it in low-protein, high-fat diets, as well as low-protein, high-carb diets, and also protein-restricted diets in general. We also see it in disease states like obesity, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, liver injuries, viral infections, chemical insults to the body and to the liver, cirrhosis, which is liver scarring, liver cancer, and then also mitochondrial dysfunction. So basically things that create metabolic stress, especially things that create metabolic stress at the liver, will increase FGF21. So FGF21 is a stress hormone. Its job is to help the body deal with metabolic insults to it in a reasonable fashion. So with this, the next question is, why does FGF21 do this in the sugar diet, and what exactly is it doing in the sugar diet? And this goes hand in hand with the pros of FGF21. So with the sugar diet, we have two things. We have very low protein intake, restriction of branched chain amino acids, particularly isoleucine, and we have very high sugar intake, specifically sugars that have fructose present with them. And the combination of these factors create a unique metabolic stress of the liver because the lack of amino acids impairs the liver's ability to undergo its normal metabolic functions as well as other anabolic processes that it needs on a regular basis. Now, the liver doesn't need to push gluconeogenesis as much or the production of carbohydrates from proteins on this diet because it's saturated with carbohydrates, but it's low in amino acids now. So that still creates a stress on the liver because the amino acids are important for more than just energy production, which is something I see in the comments. People saying, well, the diet's protein sparing because you have so much carbs. And it's like, yes, it'll protein spare to the extent that you don't need those carbs now, or you don't need those amino acids or those proteins to produce glucose from gluconeogenesis at the liver, but the liver still uses amino acids for other processes, right? Tissue maintenance, metabolic processes, enzyme production, neurotransmitter and hormone production, etc. All of these things require certain amino acids, which will be limited on the diet, and that triggers its own different set of stress. So not having enough amino acids, enough carbs, or even enough fats, all of them trigger a stress response to the body. Now, in conjunction with the lack of amino acids, we have this high sugar intake and particularly the high fructose intake. And that high fructose intake has to be processed by the liver. So the combination of these factors puts stress in the liver, and that triggers FGF21. And the low protein, high carb diet is one of the biggest triggers for FGF21 signaling because of that unique stress that's placed on the liver. And it's not just high carbohydrate, it's specifically high sugar is the strongest stimulator. So what does FGF21 do in this circumstance? How does it actually help the liver out? So FGF21, because there's not enough amino acids, tries to signal the body, hey, you need to eat more. Now, it doesn't want you to eat more carbs or sugars. It's trying to get you to eat more so it could get those amino acids, because it's kind of like if you're going to eat more, you'll probably get more amino acids just by association. So it upregulates metabolism to get you to eat more food. And also it's burning through that substrate, those carbs, those sugars that are coming in. It starts shooting those sugars, redirecting those sugars, that fuel, to the fat stores and tells the fat tissue, hey guys, just burn this stuff. We're not going to use it. We have too much of it right now, and we need more to come in so we can get those amino acids. So it's trying to get rid of the excess substrate. And that's where you see in human studies a 20% increase in metabolic rate after 5 weeks on a high carbohydrate, low protein diet, to the point that that 20% increase was needed for the people to maintain their weight. So they call this in some of the research a protein leverage effect. And basically the body's trying to eat more to get enough amino acids and then burn through the excess substrate so that you don't create a circumstance where you start putting on lots of body fat and creating metabolic issues. So FGF21 is responsible for this. Now, a little caveat here that's nice is that FGF21 can be upregulated even within one meal. So if you have a meal that's high carb, low protein, or even high fat, low protein, you can still see a bump in FGF21 signaling per meal. So it doesn't have to be, and we'll get to why this is important later when I start showing you the different dietary setups, but it doesn't have to be the whole day or multiple days that you see this effect. You see it immediately after the meal. The other piece with FGF21 is that FGF21 lowers the desire for carbohydrate consumption, particularly for sweets. Essentially, the combination of, particularly in a sugar diet, having no fat and no protein and eating large amounts of sugars while increasing the metabolic rate and lowering the desire for carbohydrates leads to a circumstance where I think people are getting into pretty significant caloric deficits because their metabolism's increased to burn off all this substrate and try to get more protein, but the person's restricting protein and fat and their desire for carbs is decreasing. So they're satiated, but they're in the deficit, and then the weight starts to come off from that circumstance. So I think as far as rapid loss of weight while feeling satiated, I think this is kind of a like magic. It kind of is a strategy that can allow you to do something like that. However, and this gets us into the cons, there are some downsides. First things first, how is FGF21 getting us to increase our metabolism? How is it bumping up that metabolic rate? Now, the way that it's doing this isn't really through the best mechanisms, and they're through mechanisms that are a bit counter to what we would want to do from a bioenergetic perspective. And essentially, it's driving up the stress hormones through increasing the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis. So it's increasing the signaling for cortisol, and it's increasing the signaling for adrenaline. Now, the cortisol's job is to help liberate some of those amino acids from the muscle tissues because we don't have them in this low protein diet. And then the adrenaline's job is to signal to the beige and brown fat stores, as well as some of the white fat stores, to basically take this fuel and just burn it off without producing ATP. So we're not getting energy, we're just making heat. It'll do this through uncoupling, and it'll do this through what's called futile cycling, where you basically just waste the energy. That doesn't produce anything. That's why they call it futile cycling. Nothing's coming out of it. And so just getting rid of the substrate, you're just burning through it. So yeah, you get this bump of metabolism, but you're doing it in a wasteful manner. You're not really getting it because you are increasing your overall energy production, or you're really upregulating overall energy metabolism. Your body is under stress and it's trying to waste the resources so that you can get enough amino acids and not have the liver be beat up by this really high sugar intake without the accompanying cofactors it needs to use those fuel sources. So it's not really the best way to try to increase metabolism in the long term. I think and we'll talk about it, there's going to be some problems with this. So some of those problems is if you're taking your fuel and you're basically burning through that fuel and you're in a stress state, there's some other processes that are going to have to get down regulated or going to have to be put on hold because you don't have the resources at this current state due to the stress that's going on. So with this, the first thing we see a down regulation in the growth hormone and IGF-1 axis at the liver. You see a resistance to this pathway, which I'm not for massively spiking up growth hormone because it basically pushes fatty acid oxidation. It's not a great thing. But I think in this context, with the lack of amino acids, the reason that this is occurring is to stop tissue growth in general and stop anabolic processes in the liver. And also this may impair some of the healing processes and minimize the protection against lean tissue loss because of this resistance. And the body's basically like, look, we don't have amino acids, so we can't really do this anabolic stuff. We can't really make more tissues. It's going to be harder to heal right now. We don't have the raw material. We don't have the bricks we need to make the house. We don't have the amino acids we need to make the muscles, the joints, the bones, this type of stuff. Which brings me to muscles and bones. In the research, let's say, take bones, for example, even giving drugs that are FGF21 analogs or mimic the effects of FGF21 in humans, we see an increase in the breakdown of bones with a decrease in the buildup of bone tissue. And in animal models, in the upregulation of FGF21, we see a loss of bone mass in some of the studies. This is really not a good thing. We don't want to lose our lean tissue as we are losing weight. I've talked about this in other videos. And bone is part of that lean tissue. You start to lower the metabolic rate. On top of that, in animal models with FGF21, we see a loss of muscle tissue. We see in animals, particularly in female animals, but also in some of the male animal models, the FGF21 drives the release of amino acids from the muscle tissue and increases the breakdown of muscle tissue and shifts the types of muscle fibers that you have in these states where you don't have enough protein. And it does it also through these stress pathways. So I think the setup puts people in a circumstance where they're probably shifting towards a more catabolic state for their lean tissue as well as their fat tissue. And that's why part of my concern with the diet is, will people potentially lose weight very rapidly? Yes. But will their percentage of lean mass that's lost be increased significantly? And I think that there is a chance that that occurs. On top of this, in female mice, what we see is a shutdown of their fertility when FGF21 gets upregulated. Because again, the body is saying, hey, we're under stress. We don't have enough resources right now. So we're going to upregulate the hormone to try to deal with these problems. And it's not really the time to reproduce. So you see a shutdown of the hypothalamic, pituitary, ovarian axis from FGF21 in animal models. So it's not really great for fertility, not really great for muscle mass, not really great for bone mass. And it's driving things through stress. So I think these are some things to know. Will people lose weight with this diet? I think they will. They already are. Is there some potential downsides to this? 100%. Everything comes with a pro and a cost. It's a pro and a con. It's just how you're going to adjust these different things. The next thing I want to talk about is something that's really important for people who are dealing with metabolic dysfunction and trying to leverage a sugar diet to manage this if they're obese or if they have diabetes, things like this. In these disease states, obesity, diabetes, coronary artery disease, heart failure, etc., FGF21 is already upregulated. Why? Because those are metabolically stressed states, and FGF21 is upregulated to help the body adapt to those states. However, in those states, what you see is FGF21 resistance. So basically, they're not responding to the FGF21 appropriately anymore, and they only are able to overcome this with FGF21 analogs. So basically, drugs that mimic the effects of FGF21. Now, for somebody who has these disease processes, if you try to go on a sugar diet and you are resistant to the effects of FGF21, it may not turn out so well. You may put a lot of pressure on the liver and create problems. So you want to be careful. You want to make sure that you're not somebody who doesn't respond to FGF21 because you already have some of these states that have unfolded, some of these disease states, and your body already tried to adapt. And you're basically at a point, the resistance point is like, we can't adapt any further. Like, you've exhausted the ability of the body to adapt. And it's through some of the inflammatory mediators, some of these different components will lower the response of the cells, the receptors to the FGF21 signaling, or upregulate the binding of FGF21 because the body's like, look, guys, we just can't do it right now. We're already tapped out. We already did all the things. We already tried to adapt and it's just not working. So you want to be careful in those circumstances. One of the big questions that I keep seeing come up again and again and again in the comment section, on calls with clients, stuff like this is, isn't it worse to be fat than it is to have the stress of losing the weight with the FGF21 or setup or the sugar diet or the caloric deficits or things or these components in general? And I would say, yeah, I think it's worse to actually have high amounts of body fat because the body fat converts androgens into estrogens. You get a higher estrogen load because the body fat itself amplifies inflammatory signaling and releases inflammatory mediators itself. And because the body fat releases free fatty acids, especially high amounts of body fat, not appropriate amounts, but high amounts will do all these things, release those free fatty acids that drive insulin resistance, that create these metabolic issues in the body. So I think taking the body fat off is extremely important for overall metabolic health. However, the goal is to do this in a way that doesn't create significant negative metabolic effects long-term for the person and also have them lose a large portion of their lean muscle tissue. And that's where my concerns are with some of these diets is rapid weight loss. It's like, what's happening under the hood? And then what does that mean for the long-term ramification? And so that's why in some people, this may work out. We're going to talk about that here right now. In other people, there may be better options available, and this is going to depend on a couple factors, so we'll go through that. Before we do that, the last thing I want to mention is just, I've seen people ask me in the comments or say in the comments, hey, Mike, this is short-term. You don't understand. This is supposed to be a long-term thing. But the thing is, we don't know even if short-term upregulation of this will create these effects because we don't actually have good and like some of the longer-term studies on this. Even if somebody was to do this, say, I'm going to sugar fast 3 days a week, every week for the next couple of years, we actually don't know what that looks like over the long term. So there's a chance it's not a problem, but something to point out here is we have people like Dr. Peter Attia, who was doing a fasting regimen, and he was only doing it I think he was doing it 3-day fast quarterly or something, and then he was doing some type of intermittent fasting during the week. And over the course, I think, of a decade, I think he lost, like, it was between 10 and 20 pounds of lean muscle tissue. That's not good for long-term outcomes. When you start to get older, 50, 60, 70, putting that lean muscle tissue back on and maintaining it is extremely important, but also very difficult to do. So we don't want to be running setups that are going to leave us frail in the long term because we're losing our bone mass and our muscle tissue. So yeah, we fit in our clothes, but by the time we're 65, 70 years old, we fall, we break our hip, and now we're in the ICU, and you got to come visit me when I was working in the ICU. You don't want to visit me in the ICU. It's not a good thing. It's not a good place to be. It's really bad outcomes for people. So we want to have a setup that allows us to maintain our lean muscle tissue. And I don't know if the sugar fasting longer term will change these components. I think 100 days is the long term to do this setup. I think more reasonable fat loss where the person is specifically losing fat and we know it's fat and there's not the lean tissue loss and some of these other concerns. I think that's the best setup, but I think this will also depend on a couple factors. And I do also think that having carbohydrates on board in this fasting phase, instead of just doing a straight fast, is also likely better. I think having the carbs there, the 100% fruit juice, the whole fruits, I think these components are better than not having them in the weight loss setup, because it at least keeps some portion of the stress down, even though other stressful factors are being upregulated. When we start talking about some of the other high amounts of refined carbohydrate sources, I think that you may introduce a new leg of damage by adjusting metabolism at the liver and adjusting metabolism of some of the lipoproteins. And I think that, and potentially adjusting things in the microbiome, I think those could be potentially problematic in different ways, even though it keeps the stress down. So how you set up the sugar diet is extremely important as well for long-term health outcomes, not just weight loss by itself. Now with this, there's two different setups I have here for you guys. I'm going to show you in Chronometer, and I want to break it down first, which one you would choose based on different context. So if you are somebody who struggles to follow through on diets in general, you're not going to sit down and like, what's my macro intake? What's my caloric intake? You're like, Mike, I'm not going to do any of that, man. I don't have time for that. I just want to see the weight come down. If you're not willing to structure the stuff out, if you don't care about long-term ramifications, if you are less concerned with your overall health, if you just want to see weight loss as fast as possible, then you're probably going to be somebody who's going to want to go towards a sugar diet. If you know that's you, that's the direction you're probably going to want to go. The caveat here is if you're in a state where you're not going to respond to FGF21 because you have resistance, then you could make things significantly worse. And I'd be very careful about doing that. But for somebody who's like, look, I just want to see the weight go down. I don't care about all this other stuff you're talking about. Yeah, science, whatever. Then sugar diet is the way to go. Like, you'll probably lose the weight pretty rapidly with the setup based on the mechanisms that we discussed. On the flip side, if you're okay with having slower weight loss, minimizing lean muscle tissue loss, you are looking for long-term sustainable health. You don't want to have a negative impact on some of the hormonal, gut health, micronutrient status, and you're okay with structuring out your meals and your diet, like creating a structure for yourself and going through some of the initial legwork, then you're probably going to want to not do a sugar diet, and you're going to want to do some of the other weight loss diets that I've talked about in other videos, because they'll give you better long-term health results and you'll still lose the weight. It'll just be a more concerted process, more sustainable process that I think is easier to come out of the back end. Now, there's one other person in here that I think is important to mention. And these are people who need to see the results fast to get them hooked into doing the thing. And so I think for some of these people, if you think, okay, if I see 10 pounds come down on the scale, like that will jumpstart me to start, getting healthier and doing right things for my health. And you'll transition into a better diet overall. And this is a step. This may be helpful, but for people who are not going to make the change overall, then you could be in a weird circumstance on the end where you run the diet, you lose the weight, and then you don't know where to go next. And then you are toggling back and forth between different diets. And you're in a circumstance where you're losing the weight and then you gain it back and you're rebounding and the metabolic concerns develop. So these are important things you can know about yourself and know about what your ultimate goals are, so you can figure out which paradigm is going to work best for you. So with that, let's actually jump in the Chronometer and I'll show you the two different setups here. All right. So option number one, and by the way, I'm going to put PDFs of these in the description so you guys can download them. People asked about in the last video, so I'll drop them here. Number one is the sugar fasting setup. And this is essentially how I would run a sugar fast. I have a whole video that I made on this, so I'll link that in the description as well. But what we're looking at here is a sugar diet setup with juices and fruits, dried fruits, whole fruits. You're making a shake here. There's some supplements added in to cover all the micronutrients. And basically the first 1, 2, 3, 4 meals is going to be these shakes, the orange juice, bananas, blueberries, dried pineapple with the supplements, some B complex, calcium, some magnesium, some zinc. And then the last meal of the day is going to be that protein heavy meal where you have some beef, some eggs, some whey protein. You have the fat there, the mac nuts, the chocolate. The rationale for this I all cover in that video. But basically this allows you to be in your sugar fast for 22 hours of the day and then break it for about 2 hours. So you're still giving your body the resources it needs. So you can have that upregulated metabolism across the front of the day and help to improve that weight loss process with the satiety and eating as much as you want. But you still give your body the resources at some point later in the day so that you are basically trying to minimize some of those downsides. So this is very similar to Anabology's honey diet setup, but obviously I made my own tweaks with this here. So it's not honey, it's whole fruits, 100% fruit juice, and then the micronutrients are dialed in here. So this would be setup one. This is somebody who wants to do the sugar diet. This is how I'd run it. If you want the details on this and why I set it up this way, please check out that other video. Again, we'll link it. Now, the second option is going to be a traditional caloric deficit. This is what I like to use. I think this is the best for long-term outcomes. I think this is the best for consistent weight loss, and it's easier for me to maintain somebody's muscle tissue, lean mass on this setup than it is, I think, with a sugar diet. So this is my normal diet, right? And what I have here is about 3,200 calories per day, 170 grams of protein, 400 grams of carbs, and about 100 grams of fat. And it's pretty similar to the other diet, except I have protein across the 4 meals. So I'll have in meal 1, I have whey. Meal 2 is some steak. Meal 3 is some steak again. And then my last meal is whey protein. And then all the other stuff is the same. It's fruits, it's dried fruits, it's 100% fruit juice. And then I have my fat source in the setup with dark chocolate and macadamia nuts. Now, this is my regular intake. All I have to do to start to lose weight, if I'm going to work with a client, is I would put a 20% deficit. Now, the 20% deficit is where I find people will start to lose weight on a consistent basis in a reasonable pace and a reasonable time frame. So, reasonable amount of weight loss in a reasonable amount of time frame without feeling like they're starving for food. And essentially, for me, this winds up being from my 3,200, I'll go to 26. I could probably go, because I'm already a little bit on the leaner side, I could probably get away with a 10% deficit. 20% might be a lot as you get a little bit leaner. If the deficits are too heavy, it starts to become too much on the system. So there's an adjustment depending on where you are. So I could probably go a little bit higher, but all I did was take that same setup. I kept my protein at 170. My carbs went to 300 and my fat went to 80. And what did this look like? All my fruits are the same. So the papaya, the cantaloupe, the dried pineapple, same amounts. I just decreased my juice in each meal from 16 ounces, so 2 glasses to 1 glass. And all I did with my fat sources was I decreased my macadamia nuts in each meal from 15 grams to 10 grams. So to lose weight, I'm on the same exact diet. I just changed the amounts of things very slightly, and the weight will just start to come off. And since my protein is high and I've dialed in all my micronutrients, I will maintain my lean tissue, and I'll also maintain my metabolic function and my micronutrient status. And it's very easy to transition out of this. Once I lose the weight I want to lose, as long as my lean muscle mass is about the same, I will basically just go back up to my other diet by increasing the amounts of things that I'm already eating and run from there. So it's not that hard to actually set up the weight loss diet. You may not have to change quite as much as you think. There's some specifics in there, but overall, this is the other option. This is for people who are more interested in maintaining long-term health, are okay with a little bit of a slower weight loss while maintaining lean muscle tissue. The sugar diet setup that we have over here is for people who are looking to just, rapidly lose as fast as possible and try to optimize this FGF21 signaling, don't really care about some of the long-term ramifications or some of the potential negative health concerns, as long as they are not FGF21 resistant. And what you'll notice with both diets, they're whole foods, right? It's proteins, good animal protein sources. It's 100% fruits and 100% fruit juice, or whole fruits, 100% fruit juice. And then I have good quality fat source here of mac nuts, dark chocolate, things like this. And I still have vegetables in the diet as well, with some broccoli and peas. Those are the things that I tend to do well with. So these are the two options that I would run with, or the two general setups or way that I would set up the two different pathways. Whichever one works for you, of course, go with. I'll put the chronometer breakdowns in the description below. And I recommend, if you are interested in the sugar diet setup and why I set up things in this fashion, check out the other video. We'll also drop that in the link, and I'll catch you all in the next video.